Welcome to another slow descent into sleep. Tonight's story begins on a reed mat, unrolled beneath the moon, where two bodies moved in silence, following rhythms older than the pyramids themselves. Here, along the Nile, love was more than desire. It was geometry. It was prayer. Every embrace mirrored the turning of stars. Every position an offering to gods who measured the world in balance and breath. The ancients left their knowledge on painted papyrus, lovers drawn in eternal postures, never finishing, never speaking, silent witnesses to an art both earthly and divine. Within these walls, the body was a temple. Touch became ritual, and the night itself carried the weight of secrets too old to name aloud. Let the rivers hush guide you. Let the moonlight steady your breath. And if these quiet wanderings bring you comfort, you might consider subscribing or telling us where and when you're listening from. Now close your eyes and step onto the reed mat, where every shadow remembers and every movement tells a story. Plea mat, a warm oil to bodies who do not speak. The reed mat had been woven in the season when the Nile ran low. Its fibers held the memory of shallow water and patient hands. And now it lay flat against the stone floor of a house that faced east, toward the place where Ra would emerge in 6 hours' time. The mat was not large. It was not small. It was the size that two bodies required when they moved, together in the oldest dance that Kemet knew. The woman with painted eyes had placed it there herself, unrolling it with the same careful attention she gave to arranging bread on a plate or oil in a lamp. There was no ceremony in this act, no special words or gestures. The mat simply went where mats went when the day's work was finished and the night's work began. The stone beneath it had been worn smooth by thousands of such nights, thousands of such mats, thousands of bodies that had moved in patterns older than the pyramids. Above them, through the gap in the reed roof, the moon hung like a silver eye that had seen everything and remembered nothing. The lunar cycle governed more than tides in this place. It measured the rhythm of body, be and flow of desire, the careful timing of touch. The ancients knew what modern people had forgotten, that love, like the river, followed its own seasons. The man who waited quietly had been oiling his skin with the mixture his grandmother had taught him to make. Sesame pressed with lotus petals, warmed over coals until it carried the scent of both earth and water. He applied it slowly, methodically, the way a scribe prepared papyrus. His chest, his arms, his thighs, each surface received the same attention. The oil would make his skin smooth under her hands, would catch the lamplight and make his body glow like polished bronze. She prepared herself with equal care, though her rituals were different. The kohl around her eyes had been applied hours ago, but she darkened it now, extending the lines that made her gaze seem endless. Her hair, oiled and braided, fell across shoulders that bore the faint marks where gold bracelets had rested during the day. She wore no perfume except what rose from her skin, the clean scent of a body washed in the river, dried in the sun, touched by oils that had been blessed by use. They did not speak because there was nothing that needed to be said. The positioning of bodies in love was not a conversation. It was an architecture, a geometry of limbs and torsos that followed principles as old as the temples. The Turin papyrus, which would be painted centuries later, would only record what was already known, that there were ways to join that honored both pleasure and the gods, ways that made the body a temple and the act a prayer. The first position was the simplest, though simple did not mean easy. She lay on her back upon the mat, legs slightly bent, arms at her sides like a figure carved in relief. Her breasts rose and fell with breath that had grown slower, deeper, as if she were already half dreaming. The painted eyes looked up at nothing, or everything, focusing on a point beyond the ceiling, where the stars arranged themselves in patterns that spelled out the names of gods. He knelt beside her, then over her, supporting his weight on arms that had lifted stones and carried grain, that knew the difference between strength and force. His approach was gradual, patient, like water finding its level. The oil on their skins made the initial touch slippery, warm, a sensation like being wrapped in liquid gold. This was the position most often depicted on tomb walls, though the artists rendered it with the same stylized formality they brought to scenes of harvest or judgment. Bodies locked in eternal embrace, forever approaching but never arriving, captured in the moment before completion, like dancers frozen mid-step. The real act was less dramatic and more repetitive, a rhythm that matched breathing, that honored the slow pulse of blood through veins. Her legs found their place around his hips with the unconscious precision of long practice. His chest pressed against hers, skin sliding against skin in patterns that left temporary maps of moisture and warmth. They moved together like two parts of a single mechanism, each motion generating the next, each breath creating space for the next breath. The lamp flame guttered slightly in a breeze that came through the window, casting shadows that danced across their joined bodies. For a moment, they looked like figures from a papyrus scroll, flat and stylized, eternal in their passionate concentration. Then the flames steadied, and they were human again, mortal flesh working toward a pleasure that was both earthly and divine. Time moved differently on the mat. Minutes stretched like honey in the sun, each sensation extending far beyond its natural borders. The woman's painted eyes remained open, watching the play of light on the ceiling, seeing visions that had nothing to do with the room around them. Her body responded to touch with a wisdom older than thought, arching and yielding in patterns that had been perfected over generations of loving. The man's breathing grew heavier, but he maintained his rhythm, his control. In Kemet, the male seed was considered precious, not to be wasted in hasty pleasure, but cultivated like a crop, tended with patience until it reached the moment of proper release. His movements were deliberate, conscious, guided by knowledge passed down from fathers who had learned from their fathers, back through an unbroken chain to the first lovers beside the first Nile. The stone floor beneath the mat had absorbed the warmth of their bodies, becoming a platform that radiated heat upward into their joined flesh. The house itself seemed to pulse with their rhythm, walls breathing in harmony. with their breathing foundation stones settling deeper into earth with each movement of their hips. Outside, the night continued its ancient business. Ibises waded through moonlit shallows. Palm fronds rustled in wind that carried the scent of river mud and growing grain. The great temples slept under stars that arranged themselves in patterns the priests would read come morning. But inside this simple house, on this simple map, two bodies wrote their own hieroglyphs in moisture and motion, sweat and shadow. Her hands moved to his shoulders, fingers tracing the landscape of muscle and bone with the careful attention of a mapmaker. His skin was warm, slightly sticky with oil and effort, marked with the small calluses and scars that told the story of a life lived with hands. She read this story through her fingertips, learning again the familiar territory of a body she knew as well as her own. Their rhythm intensified gradually, the way dawn approached the horizon, so slowly at first that the change was almost imperceptible. Then, with gathering speed and brightness, her legs tightened around him, drawing him deeper into an embrace that was both physical and metaphysical, a joining that the scribes would describe as the reunion of Nut and Geb, sky and earth, in the eternal dance of creation. The moment of completion, when it came, was neither dramatic nor silent. It was a release that moved through both bodies like wind through grain, bending them together in a shared rhythm that outlasted the individual tremors of pleasure. They held each other through the subsiding waves, breathing into each other's necks, tasting salt and sweetness on skin that had grown slick with exertion. Afterward, they remained joined for several breaths, letting their heart rates slow, feeling the gradual cooling of skin that had been heated by friction and desire. The mat beneath them was damp with their efforts, marked with the temporary geography of love. The oil they had applied hours earlier had been absorbed, replaced by the natural moisture of bodies that had worked hard and well together. When they finally separated, it was with the same careful attention they had brought to the joining. He lifted himself slowly, settling beside her on the mat, one arm remaining across her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. She turned slightly toward him, her painted eyes now heavy with satisfaction and approaching sleep, the kohl smudged but dio dark around lashes that had grown damp with effort. The lamp continued to burn, casting steady light on two bodies that had returned to stillness, but bore the marks of their recent motion, their breathing synchronized as it always did in these moments, becoming the quiet rhythm that would carry them toward sleep. The mat supported them both with patient fibers that had absorbed not just their weight, but their warmth, their scent, the invisible record of their joining. Outside, the moon continued its journey across the star-filled sky, marking time in the ancient way, measuring the night in phases that governed the tides and the hearts of lovers. In temples throughout Kemet, priests tended eternal flames that honored gods who had themselves made love in the primordial darkness, creating the world through the same urgent joining that had just played out on a simple reed mat in a simple house beside the eternal river. The stone floor had cooled slightly, but it still held warmth from their bodies, radiating it back in gentle waves that made the mat feel like a nest, a safe harbor in the vast night. Their legs remained intertwined, an unconscious intimacy that would last until dawn, when the practical business of another day would require them to resume their separate shapes, their individual purposes. But that was hours away. For now, they rested in the afterglow of successful love, bodies cooling gradually toward sleep, minds emptying of everything except the pleasant fatigue that follows good work completed. The painted eyes grew heavy, finally closing as the woman drifted toward dreams that would replay the night's motions in symbolic form. Bodies moving through landscapes of reeds and water, oil and gold. The first position was complete. The mat would remain where they had placed it, ready for tomorrow night's geometry. Tomorrow's careful arrangement of limbs and desires. The reed fibers would remember the weight and warmth of their bodies, holding that memory through the hot day ahead, through the practical hours of labor and commerce, until evening came again and the ancient dance resumed its patient, eternal rhythm. The painted eyes do not close. The gods are listening. The Turin papyrus would not be created for another 3 centuries, but the position it would later immortalize was already old when the Great Pyramids were young. The woman with rings of gold around her wrists arranged herself on the mat with the same attention a scribe brought to, laying out hieroglyphs, each element precisely placed, each curve and angle serving both function and beauty. She knelt first, then settled back on her heels, thighs slightly apart, spine straight as a column in the temple of Peta. Her hair, oiled earlier with lotus essence, fell in dark waves across shoulders that caught the lamplight like polished stone. The kohl around her eyes had been reapplied with care, creating lines that extended beyond the natural shape of her lids, giving her gaze the eternal quality of painted goddesses on tomb walls. Behind her, the man who moved like water approached with steps that made no sound on the stone floor. His skin gleamed with the oil he had warmed between his palms, a mixture his father had taught him to prepare: sesame and frankincense, beaten together with honey, until it reached the consistency of liquid amber. The scent preceded him, warm and resinous, carrying associations of temple incense and ceremonial anointing. This was the position the ancients called the reed bending toward water, a metaphor that captured both the visual beauty and the physical mechanics of the arrangement. Her body formed the curve of a plant yielding to wind, while his approach suggested the steady current that shaped riverbanks through patient repetition. The Turin artists would later render this pose with the stylized precision they brought to all sacred acts. But the living reality was softer, more fluid, marked by the small adjustments and accommodations that made abstract geometry into human pleasure. The mat beneath her knees had been woven with extra thickness, its reeds bound tightly to provide cushioning for joints that would bear weight for long periods. The ancient weavers understood that love, like worship, required comfort to achieve its highest expression. The surface texture was smooth but not slippery, offering grip without a braiding skin that would grow sensitive through repetition and pressure. She felt his hands first on her hips, fingers spreading wide to span the distance between her hip bones, thumbs resting in the small dimples just above her tailbone. The oil on his palms made the contact warm and smooth, skin sliding against skin in preparation for deeper joining. His touch was firm but not demanding, offering support and guidance without force, the way a dancer partners another dancer in movements too complex for words. The painted eyes of gods watched from the walls, eternal witnesses to acts that were both sacred and profane, divine and entirely human. In Kemet, the distinction between these categories was less clear than later civilizations would make it. The body was a temple, pleasure was a form of worship, and the joining of male and female echoed the cosmic dance that kept the world in balance. What they did on the mat was both utterly ordinary and completely sacred, like bread broken at an altar or water poured from the Nile. His entry was gradual, a slow joining that honored both anatomy and anticipation. She breathed deeply, accepting his presence with the same steady rhythm she brought to all her night work, whether grinding grain or nursing children or moving with her lover toward the small death that preceded sleep. Her body yielded and adjusted. Muscles that had borne children and lifted water jars now working in concert to create the proper balance of tension and release. The rhythm they found was older than memory, written into bone and blood by countless generations who had moved together on countless mats beside countless rivers. Her hips swayed slightly with each of his motions, creating a visual echo of wind-blown reeds or water flowing round stones. His hands remained on her waist, guiding without controlling, following the natural movement of her body while contributing his own steady pressure. From behind, he could see the elaborate architecture of her hair, dark strands woven with threads of gold that caught the lamplight and scattered it in tiny stars across her shoulders. Her neck curved like a swan's, extending the line that ran from her crown to the base of her spine, where his body joined hers in the ancient connection that had created every child in every village along the Nile. The angle of their joining was different from the previous night's embrace, deeper in some ways, more urgent in others. The position allowed him to reach places inside her that remained untouched during their face-to-face coupling, creating sensations that were both sharper and more diffuse, like the difference between lightning and aurora. She felt these new pressures, with her concentration that was almost meditative, her painted eyes focused inward on the geography of pleasure that mapped itself across her consciousness, their breathing synchronized without conscious effort. Two sets of lungs working in harmony to fuel bodies that moved with increasing intensity. The sound they made together was soft but rhythmic, like wind through palm fronds or water over stones, natural sounds that belonged to the night as much as the calls of birds or the distant lowing of cattle. The gods were indeed listening, though their attention was less judgment than recognition. Isis and Osiris had moved together in similar fashion, their cosmic coupling creating the Nile's flood and the grain's growth, the sun's path and the moon's phases. What these two bodies accomplished on their woven mat was a small echo of that greater dance, a human participation in divine rhythm that required no temple, no priest, no blessing beyond the blessing of healthy flesh and willing hearts. Her hands found new purchase on the mat, fingers spreading wide for balance as the intensity of their movement increased. The reeds beneath her palms were smooth and cool, a contrast to the heat building in her core, the warmth radiating outward from the place where their bodies joined. She could feel moisture gathering at her hairline, along her spine. In the hollow between her breasts, the body's natural cooling system working to maintain balance, even as passion threatened to overwhelm her usual composure, bind her. He watched the play of lamplight on skin that had grown slick with exertion, the way shadows moved across the landscape of her back with each motion of their joined bodies. Her spine was a river flowing between the hills of her shoulder blades, and he followed its course with eyes that had been trained by years of looking at beauty. The curve of pottery, the arch of doorways, the way light fell across grain in the winnowing basket. The position demanded endurance from both partners, but endurance was something their bodies had been trained to provide through days of physical labor, nights of careful love. Her knees pressed into the mat with steady pressure, finding a distribution of weight that could be maintained through the long, slow building of pleasure that was their practice. His legs, supporting both their weights, drew on strength built through years of walking behind plows, lifting stones, carrying grain to the storehouse. As their rhythm intensified, small sounds escaped her throat, not words, for words would have broken the spell of pure physical communication, but the soft expressions of breath shaped by pleasure. These sounds were part of the music they made together, harmonizing with the whisper of skin against skin, the quiet rustle of the mat beneath them, the distant murmur of the river that never slept. The lamp flame flickered higher as if drawn by their heat, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed this same scene countless times before, that would witness it countless times again after these particular bodies had returned to dust and been replaced by others following the same ancient patterns. The shadows they cast were momentarily dramatic, then settled back into the steady interplay of light and darkness that marked time's passage in a world without clocks. Her breathing grew deeper, more intentional, as if she were pulling air, Tao, into places where pleasure was building toward its inevitable release. The painted eyes remained open, watching visions that had nothing to do with the room around them, seeing instead the interior landscape where sensation transformed into something approaching transcendence. Her body knew this territory well, had mapped its valleys and peaks through years of patient exploration. His hands moved from her hips to her waist, then up to cup her breasts, oil-slick palms sliding over flesh that had been warmed by exertion, until it seemed to glow from within. The contact sent new waves of sensation through her body, connecting the place where they joined two nerve endings that had been waiting in quiet anticipation. Her back arched, slightly pressing into his touch, creating new angles and pressures that intensified their shared rhythm. The moment of climax, when it approached, was heralded not by drama, but by a deepening of what was already present. Breath that grew more urgent, movements that became more focused, bodies that worked together with the efficiency of long practice and deep knowledge. They had learned each other's signs and seasons, knew the precise moment when holding back transformed into letting go. Her release came in waves that seemed to originate in her core and spread outward like ripples on still water, each wave stronger than the last, until her entire body participated in the rhythmic contractions that were the body's way of celebrating successful love. She felt these sensations not as explosions, but as deep, rolling movements that connected her to the earth beneath the mat, the house around them, the vast night that contained them all. His completion followed moments later, triggered by the deep pulses of her body around his, the way her muscles contracted and released in patterns that drew his own response like tide following moon. His seed spilled into her with the same steady rhythm they had maintained. Throughout their coupling, neither rushed nor withheld, but released at precisely the right moment, in exactly the proper quantity. They remained joined for several breaths afterward, bodies cooling gradually from the heat of exertion, hearts slowing from their shared acceleration toward rest. The position that had demanded so much strength now provided its own comfort, her body supported by his weight distributed between knees and arms in a configuration that could be maintained indefinitely if necessary. When they finally separated, it was with the same care they had brought to the initial joining. He withdrew slowly, gently, allowing her body time to adjust to his absence. She remained kneeling for a moment, feeling the slight soreness that marked successful love, the pleasant fatigue that was the body's reward for work well done. The mat beneath them bore new marks of their passage, damp spots where sweat had fallen, impressions where knees and hands had pressed into the woven reeds, the invisible but present scent of bodies that had worked together toward a common goal. These marks would fade by morning, but they were part of the mat's history now, woven into its fibers like the memories of grain harvests and river floods. The painted eyes finally closed as she settled onto her side, drawing him down beside her into an embrace that was both aftermath and prelude, a resting place between one form of love and the next. Their breathing continued in harmony, even as it slowed, to bodies returning to the quiet rhythms of rest, while their skin cooled and their hearts remembered their individual beats. The gods had listened and approved, marking another successful offering on the eternal scroll, where all love was recorded, all pleasure noted and blessed. The night continued its patient rotation around them, carrying their small drama forward toward dawn, toward the practical day that would require them to assume their separate roles and responsibilities. But for now, they rested in the satisfaction of the second position, bodies marked by oil and effort, hearts synchronized with the vast pulse that moved through river and desert, temple and home, connecting all lovers to the cosmic dance that had created the world and would sustain it until the last star dimmed and the final flood receded from the Nile's banks. No one asked why. The stone remembers posture, The limestone blocks that formed the eastern wall of the house had been quarried from cliffs that overlooked the Nile. During the season when the water ran low and the stone cutters could work close to the river's edge, each block bore the marks of bronze chisels, the patient scratches and gouges that spoke of human hands shaping raw stone into the proponents of shelter. These blocks had absorbed 40 years of morning sunlight, 40 seasons of night cold, 40 cycles of flood and recession. They had learned to hold heat and release it slowly, creating a wall that was both barrier and radiator, protection and comfort. Against this wall, the woman with braided hair positioned herself with the same careful attention she brought to all her night work. She knelt facing the stone, palms pressed flat against its surface, feeling the warmth it had captured during the day now radiating back into her skin. Her knees found their proper spacing on the mat, thighs apart, spine curved in the graceful arch that artists would later immortalize in paint and relief, though none would capture the living subtlety of muscles adjusting and readjusting to find the perfect balance between stability and flexibility. The wall knew about kneeling. It had supported the weight of countless bodies over the decades since its construction. Workers resting between tasks, children playing games that required crouching, women grinding grain on stones that needed the leverage of bent knees. But the wall also knew about a different kind of kneeling. The nighttime postures of lovers who used its solid presence as anchor and support for movements that were both ancient and eternally new. Behind her, the man who understood patience approached with oil-slicked hands that would soon map the territory of her back, her hips, the curve where her spine disappeared between the hills of her buttocks. He had prepared himself with even more care tonight, knowing that this position would demand sustained strength from his legs, his core, the complex architecture of muscles that would support both their weights while maintaining the rhythm that was love's most essential requirement. The oil tonight was different frankincense mixed with sweet almond, heated over coals until it reached body temperature, then strained through linen to remove any grittiness that might distract from smooth skin sliding. Dare against smooth skin. The scent was ceremonial without being overwhelming, rich enough to create atmosphere but not so heavy as to compete with the natural fragrances that two healthy bodies would generate through sustained physical effort. She felt his approach first as warmth against her back, then as the light contact of skin testing skin, checking for readiness for the precise angles that would transform individual bodies into a single mechanism of pleasure. His hands found her hips with practiced accuracy, thumbs tracing the dimples that marked the base of her spine, fingers spreading to encompass the width of hip bones that had been shaped by childbearing into the perfect architecture for love. The wall received her weight as he entered her from behind limestone, accepting the forward pressure of a body that yielded and pushed simultaneously, finding in stone the immovable support that allowed complete surrender to the movements that were about to begin. Her palms pressed harder against the rough surface, feeling the tiny irregularities that marked each block's individual character, the way the mason had fitted stone to stone with mortar, that had now hardened into permanent union. This was the position the tomb painters would render with greatest frequency. Though their stylized figures could never capture the live heat of bodies finding their rhythm. The way breath quickened and synchronized, the gradual building of pressure that would eventually demand release. The painted lovers on tomb walls knelt in eternal preparation, forever approaching but never achieving the moment of completion that made all the careful positioning worthwhile. The angle was different from their previous night's explorations, deeper and more direct, allowing him access to places inside her that remained untouched during face-to-face coupling. She felt these new pressures as sharp points of sensation that connected to nerve pathways she had almost forgotten existed, creating a map of pleasure that was both more specific and more diffuse than their earlier positions had provided. The wall absorbed not just her weight, but the vibrations of their movement. Tiny tremors that traveled through limestone blocks and into the foundation stones, the mud brick base, the patient earth that supported them all. In a sense, the entire house participated in their couplings, walls and floor and ceiling beam working together to contain and amplify the ancient rhythms that had been practiced in such spaces since humans first learned to build shelter around their most private acts. Her breathing grew deeper as their pace increased, each exhalation a small prayer offered to the stone that supported her, the man who filled her, the night that contained them both. The painted eyes were closed now. Concentration turned entirely inward to the place where sensation was building, toward the inevitable moment when individual awareness would dissolve into something larger, older, more connected to the fundamental forces that moved river and stars and the hearts of lovers throughout the long valley of the Nile. His hands moved from her hips to her waist, then up to trace the landscape of her back, fingers reading the story written in muscle and vertebra. The way her spine curved and straightened with each thrust, each breath, each small adjustment that kept their joining balanced between effort and surrender. The oil made his touch smooth but not slippery, warm but not burning, creating the perfect friction for skin that would soon grow sensitive with sustained stimulation. The rhythm they found was neither fast nor slow, but something more complex, a pattern that matched the deeper pulses of blood through arteries, air through lungs, the ancient timing that connected all living things to the cosmic dance of creation. Her body swayed slightly with each movements, creating a visual echo of grain bending in wind, water flowing around stones, the way all natural things yielded to force while maintaining their essential integrity. From his position behind her, he could watch the play of lamplight on skin that had been warmed by effort, until it seemed to glow from within, the way shadows moved across the geography of her back with each motion of their joined bodies. Her hair, braided with gold thread that caught and scattered light, swayed with their movements like dark water flowing over polished stones, creating patterns of illumination that shifted too quickly to be mapped, but slowly enough to be admired. The wall continued its patient support, limestone blocks that had been cut from living rock now serving as foundation for living flesh. the boundary between what was built and what was born blurring in the heat of sustained physical effort. Stone remembered everything. The hands that had quarried it, the tools that had shaped it, the mortar that had bound it into walls, and now the weight of bodies using its stability as launching point for flights into pleasure that were both entirely physical and somehow transcendent. Her painted eyes remained closed, but behind the lids she saw visions that had nothing to do with the room around them. Landscapes of reeds and water, gold and shadow, bodies moving through spaces that were both interior and infinite. These were the visions that came to women in moments of deep pleasure, when the boundaries between self and other, body and spirit, earth and sky became permeable enough for older truths to emerge. The tempo increased gradually. The way dawn approached the horizon or floodwaters rose in the Niles. So slowly at first that change was barely perceptible. Then, with gathering momentum that made the final acceleration seem both inevitable and miraculous, her fingers pressed harder against the stone, seeking purchase for the intensity that was building in her core, the growing pressure that would soon demand release in rhythmic waves that would connect her momentarily to the cosmic forces that governed tides and seasons, and the movement of celestial bodies across the star-filled sky. His breathing grew heavier, but remained controlled, the product of years spent learning that male pleasure was best achieved through patience rather than haste, endurance rather than explosive release. In Kemet, the body was understood to be a temple that required proper maintenance, careful tending, respect for its rhythms and needs. What they accomplished on the mat was both physical exercise and spiritual practice, a form of moving meditation that honored the divine spark that animated all flesh. The moment of climax approached like flood season, gradually at first, then with increasing urgency as natural forces overcame individual will and swept both bodies into the ancient current that connected all lovers to the original coupling of gods who had created the world through their passionate joining. Her release came in deep, rolling waves that seemed to originate in the place where his body joined hers and spread outward, through nerve and muscle, until her entire being participated in the rhythmic contractions that were the body's celebration of successful love. The wall received the extra pressure of her climax without complaint. Limestone blocks that had supported the weight of houses and tombs, now accepting the momentary intensity of a woman lost in pleasure, her palms pressing against stone with force that left temporary impressions in skin, but no permanent marks on rock that had already survived centuries of weather and time. His completion followed soon after, triggered by the deep pulses of her internal muscles, the way her entire body seemed to draw him deeper into an embrace that was both physical and metaphysical. His seed spilled into her with the same measured rhythm they had maintained throughout their coupling, neither rushed nor delayed, but released at the precise moment, when holding back would have been more difficult than letting go. They remained joined for several breaths afterward, both bodies leaning into the wall's support, while hearts slowed and breathing returned to normal rhythms. The limestone had absorbed some of their heat, becoming a warm companion that held them in stable embrace, while they recovered from the intensity of shared climax. Stone and flesh worked together in this moment, the built environment and the biological occupants finding temporary harmony in the aftermath of successful love. When they finally separated, it was with gratitude for the wall's support, the mat's cushioning, the oil's smoothing of rough edges that might otherwise have distracted from pleasure's pure pursuit. She turned from the stone slowly, carefully, feeling the slight soreness that marked joints that had worked hard and well, muscles that had found new ways to cooperate in service of desire that was both individual and cosmic. The wall retained no visible record of their passage, but limestone was known to hold memories in ways that transcended the merely visible. The blocks would remember the warmth of her palms, the vibration of their movement, the way human bodies had used stone as foundation for flights into pleasure that connected earth to sky, flesh to spirit, individual desire to the cosmic dance that kept stars in their courses and rivers in their beds. They settled onto the mat together, her back against his chest in an arrangement that allowed the wall to continue supporting them both as they cooled toward sleep. The stone radiated back the heat it had absorbed, creating a microclimate of warmth that would sustain them through the coolest part of the night, when the desert wind carried memories of spaces where no river flowed and no lovers met on mats, woven from reeds that had grown in the fertile mud beside eternal water. The third position was complete, recorded not in papyrus or painted on tomb walls, but written into the molecular structure of limestone that would outlast the bodies it had supported, build the house it helped to build, the civilization that had taught these two people the ancient arts of love that transformed animal need into something approaching worship, physical pleasure into spiritual practice, the joining of individual bodies into participation in the cosmic dance that had created the world and would sustain it until the last lover learned the final position and the eternal mat was rolled up for the last time. When gold flickered and no one looked away, the oil had been prepared during the day's brightest hour, when Ra's eye looked directly down upon the house and cast no shadows in the rooms where night's work would later be conducted. The woman with fingers like water had selected each ingredient with the care usually reserved for medicines or offerings to gods. Sesame seeds pressed when the moon was dark frankincense tears that had wept from trees growing in distant mountains. Blue lotus petals harvested at the precise moment when their scent reached its most intoxicating concentration. The mixing had been ceremonial without being religious, a domestic ritual that connected her to generations of women who had learned the art of creating oils that enhanced rather than masked the natural fragrances of healthy bodies in love. She heated the mixture slowly over coals that had been blessed by no priest but by years of faithful service, stirring with a wooden spoon worn smooth by countless preparations, watching as separate elements merged into something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Now, as evening shadows lengthened, and the first stars appeared in the deep blue sky above the Nile, the oil waited in a clay vessel that had been warmed by the lamp's steady flame. Its surface was calm, but expectant, reflecting the small fire that would provide tonight's light, holding within its golden depths the promise of skin made luminous, friction transformed into pleasure, bodies that would soon move together with all the smooth inevitability of well-oiled mechanisms. The man who understood timing had spent the afternoon in preparation that was less visible but equally important. He had bathed in the river when the sun reached its western descent, using sand to scrub away the day's dust and honest sweat, then oil of cedar to cleanse his hair until it shone like polished bronze. His nails had been cut with obsidian blades, his beard trimmed to the length that would not scratch tender skin, his entire body prepared as carefully as a temple statue before a festival. They began the oiling together, a ritual that was both practical and profoundly intimate, each partner attending to the other's body with the focused attention of artists preparing canvas for painting. She dipped her fingers into the warm oil and began with his shoulders, spreading the liquid across muscle that had been hardened by years of physical labor, but now served the more delicate purpose of supporting another body's weight during the sustained movements that love required. The oil transformed his skin from matte to luminous, creating a surface that caught and held lamplight like polished metal. Her hands moved in slow, deliberate strokes, covering his chest, his arms, the flat plane of his stomach, where dark hair grew in patterns that would soon be mapped by her fingers, her lips, the internal geography of desire that recognized no boundaries between touching and being touched. His turn came next, and he began with equal ceremony, warming the oil, bit in his palms before applying it to skin that had been made ready by anticipation, by the careful removal of all barriers between flesh and pleasure. Her back received his attention first, the long curve of spine that disappeared between shoulder blades like a river flowing toward hidden valleys, each vertebra a stepping stone on the path that connected head to hips, thought to sensation, the place where decisions were made to the place where they were felt most deeply. The oil spread beneath his hands with the consistency of liquid silk, coating skin that had been warmed by lamplight and anticipation, until it seemed to glow from within. Her breathing deepened as his palms moved across the landscape of her body, not yet sexual, but profoundly sensual, preparing flesh for the more intensive touch that would follow. The oil would serve multiple purposes tonight: lubricant and perfume, protection against friction and enhancement of sensation, the medium through which two bodies would discover new configurations of pleasure. When the preparation was complete, they were both transformed, ordinary flesh made luminous by oil that reflected light like water in golden vessels. They moved toward each other with the careful precision of dancers who had rehearsed these steps for years, but still found new subtleties in familiar movements. The mat beneath them had been prepared with equal care, its woven surface cleaned and smoothed, positioned to receive bodies that would soon press into its fibers with the urgency of desire made manifest. Tonight's position was one the tomb painters rarely depicted, perhaps because its intimacy was too complete for public walls, too private for the eternal gaze of gods and pharaohs. She lay on her back, legs raised and parted while he knelt between her thighs in a configuration that brought their faces close enough for shared breath. Their bodies aligned in the most direct possible connection between male and female anatomy. The oil made their initial contact impossibly smooth. His entry a gradual penetration that met no resistance, except the natural tension of muscles that knew how to welcome and hold, how to create the perfect balance between tightness and yielding. Her legs found their place around his waist with unconscious precision, ankles crossing at the small of his back, drawing him deeper into an embrace that was both physical anchor and emotional commitment. Their faces were close enough that they could see their own reflection in each other's eyes, painted pupils that had been darkened with coal now dilated with desire, creating windows into interior landscapes where pleasure was building like floodwaters behind a dam. The lamplight flickered across their oil-slicked skin, creating patterns of illumination that shifted with each movement, each breath, each small adjustment that brought them closer to the perfect alignment of body with body, desire with satisfaction. The rhythm they found was slower than previous nights, more deliberate, governed by the knowledge that oil burned longer than passion, that pleasure sustained through patience was deeper than pleasure seized through haste. Her hips moved in small circles that created new angles of penetration, new pressures against nerve endings that had been waiting in quiet. Anticipation for exactly this combination of touch and timing. His hands supported his weight, while also exploring the territories that oil had made newly accessible. The curves of her breasts, the hollow of her throat, the places where gold jewelry had left faint impressions on skin that was now free of all ornament, except the luminous coating that made her seem like a goddess carved from precious metal. The oil carried scent, as well as smoothness, filling the space around them with fragrances that were both earthy and ethereal, connecting them to gardens where lotus bloomed and frankincense trees wept aromatic tears. The house around them seemed to pulse with their rhythm, mud brick walls breathing in harmony with bodies that had found a tempo deeper than heartbeat, older than conscious thought. The oil lamp provided steady light that revealed without exposing, illuminated without judgment, casting shadows that danced in patterns too complex for memory, but simple enough for bodies to follow instinctively. Her painted eyes remained open, watching his face as it moved through the subtle transformations that marked a man's journey from control to abandon, from the careful management of desire to its complete surrender. She could see the moment when his individual will dissolved into something larger, when personal pleasure became participation in forces that had been moving through the world since the first coupling of earth and sky, water and fire, the elemental unions that had created everything that lived and breathed and loved beside the eternal river. The oil made sounds as well as smoothness, the quiet music of skin sliding against skin, bodies finding new configurations of contact as their movements grew more urgent, more focused on the places where sensation concentrated into something approaching transcendence. Her breathing grew deeper, more intentional, as if she were drawing air down, be into the very center of her being, feeding internal fires that would soon burn bright enough to consume all awareness except the pure experience of flesh, joined to flesh in patterns older than memory. His control was impressive, but not infinite, and she could sense the moment approaching when holding back would require more effort than letting go. The oil that had begun as preparation was now part of the experience itself, creating sensations that were both more intense and more sustainable than dry friction could provide. Their bodies moved together with the efficiency of mechanisms that had been designed for exactly this purpose, every curve and angle serving the greater goal of mutual pleasure. The moment of her climax arrived like sunrise, gradually at first, then with gathering brightness that transformed the entire landscape of sensation into something that was both utterly physical and somehow transcendent. The oil made her skin hypersensitive to touch, creating waves of pleasure that began where their bodies joined and radiated outward until her entire being participated in rhythmic contractions that seemed to connect her to the cosmic dance of creation itself. He felt her release through his own body, the deep pulses of her internal muscles drawing his own response with magnetic inevitability. The oil that had facilitated their joining now enhanced their completion, creating sensations of warmth and pressure that intensified the natural rhythms of climax until individual pleasure became shared transcendence. To bodies participating in the ancient ceremony that connected all lovers to the original coupling of God. They remained joined for long minutes afterward, oil-slicked skin cooling gradually in air that carried the sense of frankincense and satisfaction. Bodies that had worked hard and well together, now resting in the afterglow of successful love. The oil continued to serve them even in stillness, maintaining the smooth contact between skin that might otherwise have grown sticky with cooling sweat, keeping them comfortable in positions that ordinary friction would have made impossible to sustain. When they finally separated, it was with reluctance for the loss of contact, pity and gratitude for oil that had made their joining both more intense and more comfortable than nature alone could have provided. The lamp continued to burn with the same steady flame that had witnessed their preparation, their coupling, their completion, marking time in a house where love was practiced as carefully as any other craft that required skill, patience, and the proper tools. The oil vessel sat empty now, its contents transferred to skin that still gleamed with residual coating, bodies that would carry the sense and smoothness of their preparation into sleep and dreams, that would replay the night's movements in symbolic form. The clay container would be refilled tomorrow, the careful mixing repeated with ingredients selected for their ability to transform ordinary touch into something approaching the sacred. They settled into sleep still lightly coated with oil that would be absorbed gradually by skin that had been made receptive by exertion and pleasure, by the deep fatigue that followed successful physical love. The oil had indeed burned slower than touch, sustaining them through hours of careful exploration, providing the medium through which two bodies had discovered new possibilities for connection. new ways of using familiar flesh to achieve unfamiliar transcendence. The fourth position was complete, recorded not in stone or papyrus, but in the molecular memory of oil that had served its purpose completely, transforming from preparation to experience to aftermath, from separate ingredients to integral part of the ancient dance that connected earthly lovers to cosmic forces that moved through stars and rivers, temples and simple houses where ordinary people practiced the extraordinary art of making love last longer than a single night, deeper than a single sensation, more luminous than any lamp could provide, because they never stopped, because they never aged, because they only watched. The tomb wall had been painted during the season when the Nile ran high, and the artists could work in chambers that would remain sealed for millennia, creating images designed to last until the world itself grew old and the river forgot its course. The painted lovers knelt in eternal embrace, their stylized bodies locked in positions that were both human and divine, earthly and cosmic, frozen at the moment before completion, like dancers caught between one note and the next. They were silent because silence was eternal. Words belonged to the living world, to the realm of breath and heartbeat, decision and consequence. But paint belonged to forever, to the space beyond time where all lovers eventually arrived, where all positions were simultaneously preparation and fulfillment, where desire needed no resolution because it was itself the resolution, the answer to questions that living bodies could only approach through the temporary joining of flesh with flesh. The woman with eyes that held starlight arranged herself on the mat for by the final time, her body now familiar with the geometry of love, trained through 4 nights of careful exploration to understand the subtle mathematics of pleasure. Tonight she moved with the confidence of someone who had mapped the territory thoroughly, who knew which positions served comfort and which served transcendence, which angles honored the body's limitations and which pushed beyond them into realms that were both physical and metaphysical. The painted lovers watched without judgment from their eternal prison of limestone and pigment, bodies that had been rendered in the stylized perfection that Egyptian artists brought to all sacred subjects. Their faces showed no strain, no particular emotion beyond the calm attention that marked all figures in tomb paintings, whether they were harvesting grain, conducting religious ceremonies, or demonstrating the positions that connected earthly love to cosmic principle. But their silence held wisdom that living lovers could only glimpse in moments of deepest joining, when individual consciousness dissolved temporarily into something larger, older, more connected to the fundamental forces that moved through the world like breath through body, water through reed beds, light through the calculated spaces between temple columns. The man who had learned patience through repetition approached her with hands that now carried the memory of 4 nights' exploration, fingers that had mapped the territory of her body until they could navigate its valleys and hills by touch alone. In darkness, guided by knowledge that was both tactile and somehow deeper than mere physical familiarity, tonight's position would combine elements from all the previous nights, a synthesis of approaches that honored both comfort and intensity, both the body's need for pleasure and its capacity for transcendence. She knelt, but not as she had against the wall. She reclined, but not as she had on the first night. The configuration they achieved was uniquely their own, developed through nights of careful experimentation, refined through repetition until it served all their needs simultaneously. The painted lovers had never needed to experiment. They had been created in perfect knowledge, their bodies positioned by artists who understood the eternal principles that governed the joining of male and female, the cosmic dance that kept the world in balance. But living lovers had to discover these principles through trial and error, through nights of exploration that gradually revealed the deeper harmonies underlying physical pleasure. Her body received him now with the ease of long familiarity, muscles that had learned to accommodate his presence without effort, flesh that had been trained through repetition to find the perfect balance between resistance and yielding. The oil was unnecessary tonight. Their bodies had developed their own natural lubrication, the internal adjustments that came when desire was sustained over time, when pleasure was approached as a craft to be mastered rather than an accident to be hoped for. The rhythm they found incorporated all their previous discoveries. The deep penetration of the second night, the steady support of the third, the smooth coordination of the fourth. But it also included something new, something that could only emerge from the accumulated knowledge of bodies that had worked together, long enough to transcend technique and achieve something approaching art. The painted lovers knew this secret, though they could never speak it. In the eternal realm they occupied, all positions were simultaneous, all pleasures concurrent, all climaxes perpetual. They experienced the constant now of perfect satisfaction, bodies forever approaching and forever achieving the moment of completion that living lovers could only glimpse briefly before it dissolved back into time, into the world of before and after, preparation and aftermath. But tonight, for the span of several hours, the living lovers achieved something approaching that eternal now, their bodies moving in patterns that seemed to slow time, to create spaces between heartbeats where pleasure expanded beyond the boundaries of individual flesh and became something that was both utterly personal and completely universal. The house around them participated in this temporary transcendence, walls breathing with rhythms that matched their own, foundation stones settling deeper into earth that had supported such love for millennia, would continue supporting it until the river changed its course and the desert reclaimed the fields where grain grew in soil enriched by countless floods, countless seasons of growth and harvest, birth and death, love and separation. Her painted eyes remained open, but saw visions that had nothing to do with the room around them. Landscapes that were both interior and infinite, populated by figures that moved with the same eternal rhythm. They were creating on their woven mat. She was briefly connected to every woman who had ever loved beside this river, every female body that had discovered the same deep pulses, the same waves of sensation that connected individual pleasure to cosmic principle. His awareness expanded in similar directions, consciousness that briefly encompassed not just his own body, but all the male bodies that had ever moved in these patterns, that had learned the same lessons about patience and timing, about the difference between taking pleasure and sharing it, between the satisfaction of individual release and the transcendence that came from joining individual desire to something infinitely larger. The painted lovers watched this temporary apotheosis with the calm attention they brought to all earthly activities, eternal witnesses to the moment when mortal flesh achieved something approaching immortal satisfaction. They had been painted in positions of love precisely because love was the human activity that most closely approached the eternal, the realm beyond time where all desire was simultaneously present and fulfilled. The climax, when it came, was different from the previous night's knot, more intense but more complete, involving not just the bodies on the mat, but the house around them, the night that contained them, the river that provided the fundamental rhythm underlying all smaller rhythms. For several breaths, they achieved the same eternal now that characterized the painted lovers, the same simultaneous experience of approaching and arriving, seeking and finding individual desire and cosmic satisfaction. The moment passed, as such moments must in the world of living bodies, but it left both partners transformed in subtle ways, marked by the brief contact with eternal principles that would influence all their future joining, all their subsequent explorations of the ancient positions that connected earthly lovers to celestial mechanics. The painted lovers returned to their eternal silence, their perpetual watching, their simultaneous participation in all positions at once. But they had served their purpose as witnesses, as reminders that love was both utterly temporary and completely permanent, bounded by individual lifespans, but connected to patterns that would outlast any particular house, any specific couple, any individual civilization that happened to flourish beside whatever river happened to be running through whatever landscape happened to be supporting human life at any particular moment in the vast calendar of geological time. The living lovers settled into sleep that would be deeper than usual. Bodies that had been thoroughly explored and satisfied, now ready for the restoration that came with successful physical love. The mat beneath them held the memory of 5 nights' exploration, fibers that had absorbed not just weight and moisture, but something more subtle, the resonance of bodies that had achieved temporary harmony with eternal principles. The lamp continued to burn with flame that would outlast their sleep, providing light that would witness their rest as it had witnessed their activity, marking time in a house where love had been practiced as both craft and art, physical exercise and spiritual discipline, individual pleasure and participation in the cosmic dance that connected all things to all other things in patterns too complex for conscious understanding, but simple enough for bodies to follow instinctively. The painted lovers would continue their eternal watching from tomb walls that would outlast the house, the couple, the civilization that had created both the paintings and the practices they depicted. Their silence would endure because they had transcended the need for words, achieving the permanent now, where all positions were simultaneous, all pleasure perpetual, all love, both completely personal and utterly universal. The 5th position was complete, though completion was perhaps the wrong word for something that was both ending and beginning, both culmination and preparation for future exploration. The ancient arts of love were not skills to be mastered once, but practices to be refined continuously, positions to be inhabited more deeply with each repetition, silence to be achieved more completely with each surrender to the eternal rhythms that moved through stars and rivers, temples and simple houses where ordinary people discovered the extraordinary truth that love was both utterly temporary and completely permanent, bounded by individual lifespans but connected to patterns that would continue until the last lovers learned the final position and the eternal dance finally came to rest. The mat would be rolled away with morning light. The oil would be prepared again when evening came. The painted lovers would continue their eternal watching from walls that knew all secrets, remembered all positions, witnessed all love with the patient attention of stone that had learned to hold more than weight, more than structure, more than the simple separation between inside and outside, private and public, human and divine. The Nile would continue its flow toward seas that held the memory of all rivers, carrying the sediment of all mountains, all valleys, all fields where grain grew in soil, enriched by the patient cycle of flood and recession, growth and harvest, love and separation, joining and parting, that marked time in a world where everything changed except the eternal principles that governed the joining of bodies, the movement of water, the path of stars across skies that held the dreams of lovers who had learned that silence was the deepest wisdom, watching the most complete participation, and love the most accurate measure of time.